Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. Now when it comes to long-term food storage, almost every prepper knows that they should be storing beans and rice. When they're eaten together, they form a complete protein, and that's a big part of our diet, and they're also fairly easy to store. We also know about storing salt and sugar because they're also an important part of our diet, and they have an indefinite shelf life. But there are a lot of foods out there that would be excellent choices for long-term food storage that don't get nearly the attention that they deserve. So in this video, we're going to be going over some foods that you should probably be stockpiling that you may have overlooked. These are going to give your diet more variety, which in addition to being useful from a nutritional keep your body going standpoint, it's also going to help you stay sane as well. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to be caught for months or maybe even years just eating beans and rice. I think that would actually make me go crazy. And in this video, we're going to be using bags and oxygen absorbers supplied by Wallaby Goods, so I'd like to thank them for sending those to us and for sponsoring this video. The first survival food that a lot of people overlook is quinoa. When stored properly, it can last for 20 years or more, and it's useful in things like soups, salads, or as a standalone side dish. One very good thing about quinoa is that it's packed with nutrients. Just 1 cup of it can provide 39% of your daily value of copper, 25% of magnesium, along with a lot of others. It's also high in fiber and is a good source of protein. And another advantage that it has is that it's gluten-free. So if you have somebody in your family with either celiac disease or some sort of gluten sensitivity, then it's going to be a good option for them. Now, the thing about it is, a lot of us have never eaten quinoa as part of our regular diet. So before you go and stockpile a whole bunch of it, you probably want to at least just buy like maybe a small bag of it, test it out, be sure that it's something that you and your loved ones can handle eating, and if it is, go ahead and get a lot more. Another good long-term survival food that a lot of people overlook is rolled or instant oats. These are steamed, rolled, flattened, and dried, and this process, when combined with Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers, can allow those to last for up to 30 years. Now, other kinds of oats may not last as long. Oats, of course, can be used in oatmeal, but you can use them other ways also. You can use them to help you make homemade granola or to make things like muffins or pancakes, and they can be found in gluten-free varieties as well. Instant mashed potatoes are another food that can give some variety to your diet and can be stored for a very long time. Now, while it's always a good idea to grow your own potatoes as much as possible, having potato flakes on hand will give you a way that you can enjoy them if you're waiting on your crop to grow or if you can't garden for one reason or another. In addition to being used to make mashed potatoes, potato flakes can also be used to make things like potato soup or as a breading on something like chicken or fish. And like rolled oats, you can purchase them gluten-free. Another food that you should be sure to store is cornmeal. Probably the most obvious way to use it is, of course, to make cornbread, but you can also use it to make things like pizza crust or to help you fry something. Cornmeal, when stored properly, can last at least 5 or 10 years in Mylar bags. However, it may have a higher moisture content than some other dry goods. Because of this, you definitely need to keep an eye out for signs of botulism, which is an incredibly dangerous bacteria. Probably the most common sign that your food has been affected by this is like the bag becoming puffy or inflated, and if you notice this, just go ahead and throw it away. Corn masa or masa harina is similar to cornmeal, but is ground a little finer and soaked in an alkaline solution like calcium hydroxide, giving it a different flavor. It has a powdery consistency similar to white flour and is used to make tortillas and other Mexican dishes like tamales. I actually store quite a bit of corn masa. My family and I love Mexican food, so having a way to make tortillas is an absolute must. And when I garden, a lot of the plants that I grow tend to be things like jalapenos, bell peppers, and tomatoes that can be used in things like salsas. One important thing to understand about corn masa is that it may have a shorter shelf life than cornmeal. There's not a whole lot of consistent information available about that online, so I would kind of err more towards the side of caution and count on maybe getting 3 to 5 years of storage life from it. So just use it and rotate it out. And if you open the bag and it smells rancid, just get rid of it. And of course, you can also store dry corn as well. Field corn is a good choice for this. It can last for up to 25 years or more if stored properly. But if you store that and you're wanting to use it to make things like cornmeal, you're going to need a pretty hefty grain mill to be able to do that because it's not the easiest stuff to process. And also, you want to avoid storing things like seed corn or feed corn for you and your family because that stuff, it can have things like pesticides or other chemicals on it that may make it unsuitable for human consumption. And while you can store flour in Mylar bags, it only has a shelf life of around 5 years. However, wheat berries have a much longer shelf life. If you have something like a grain mill, then you can grind those wheat berries into flour, but there's other ways that you can prepare them without grinding them at all. For instance, you can soak them in water for at least 12 hours and then either eat them as is or add them to things like soup or chili. When stored in Mylar with oxygen absorbers, wheat berries can last for 25 years or more. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that it was sponsored by Wallaby Goods. They have recently come out with their own line of heat sealers that you can use to seal their Mylar bags and other kinds of plastic bags as well. They have a few different sizes, and the one shown here is the 12-inch model, which is big enough to handle anything except 5-gallon bucket liners. Sealers like this work much better on non-gusseted bags than hair straighteners do because you don't have to have them standing up while you're sealing them, and their heating elements are only active while you're actually sealing bags. This means you don't have to worry about accidentally damaging something like your kitchen table by setting a hot hair straightener down onto it. And if you think this is something you may be interested in, then you can check them out on Wallaby's website. Even though it's pretty well known, dried pasta is still worth mentioning. It can be used in all sorts of dishes. You can add it into something as simple as tomato soup to have something like shells and tomato soup. You can use it to create full dishes like spaghetti or lasagna. Or you can have pasta just as a standalone side dish. Of course, it's going to taste a lot better if you can put a sauce with it, but I mean, if you need to, you can just eat it by itself. It also has a lot of other advantages. For example, it's high in things like protein, iron, and carbs, and it's also very stable and can be stored for 25 years or more in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers. When I packed this penne, I added some extra oxygen absorbers since there was a lot of dead airspace in the pasta itself. You can also find gluten-free pasta fairly easily, so if you have folks in your family with gluten issues, that's a very good way for them to get the grains that they need. Another gluten-free item that's fairly easy to find is gluten-free flour, but the thing about storing any kind of flour is that it's always going to have a shorter shelf life than just the grains before they're ground into the flour. And also, cooking with gluten-free flour can be a little bit different than regular flour, so make sure that you know how to do that, you know all the ins and outs of it before you actually need to cook with it so that you don't waste a bunch of it trying to figure it out. Another good long-term storage food that a lot of folks don't talk about are lentils. These are similar to beans. They have good iron and protein contents, but they don't take as long to prepare. Things like pinto beans, you have to soak them in water before you boil and cook them, but lentils, you don't have to soak them. You can just start boiling them directly, so this is gonna make preparing them a lot easier. And if you're preparing for a long-term disaster, it's important to store more than just food. Things like instant coffee are excellent for boosting morale and can be good barter items as well. You can store it in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers for 20 years or more, and while it may not be as good as fresh coffee, it's gonna be a lot better than nothing, especially if you've gone without it for a while. It's also a good idea to store drink mixes. These can include things like Kool-Aid, along with sports drink mixes like Gatorade. Since they're basically sugar, drink mixes like these can be stored pretty much indefinitely in Mylar bags. You can just slip the small packets right into a Mylar bag, but don't use oxygen absorbers with powder drink mixes since they can make them turn hard. Sports drink mixes like Gatorade are good since they can help you rehydrate if you lose a lot of fluids from sweating or from illnesses like stomach bugs. But if you're ill, you may want to dilute them down just a little bit more to make them a little easier for your stomach to handle since they have such a high sugar content. And I went ahead and poured the mix from the can into Mylar since the can isn't all metal, and I was also sure to put the scoop inside the bag as well. Jello powder is another good thing to store, and like drink mixes, has a high sugar content. This will give it a long shelf life, but you want to avoid using oxygen absorbers with these. Jello can be used a lot of different ways. It can be used to make the gelatin dessert that we all know, can be used in other recipes, and it can also be used as a drink mix. Now you might be wondering, how in the world are you going to prepare Jello in a grid down situation? Well, if it's winter and it's 34 degrees or below outside, outside, you can mix it up in the house and then just set it outside and let it cool down and congeal just like it would in the fridge. Or if you have a small solar setup and then a 12-volt fridge, then you can prepare it pretty much the way that you normally would without using a whole lot of energy. To store it, just take the bag out of the box and slide it into a Mylar bag. You may want to make a small tear in the bag to help squeeze the air out. If you're careful, you probably won't lose too much of it. Powdered milk is another thing that you should add to your long-term food storage. You can use it pretty much the same way that you would use regular milk, like as a drink or as an ingredient in things like mashed potatoes, muffins, or oatmeal. And non-fat dry milk can last between 15 and 20 years if stored in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber. And different kinds of spices are another thing that you should store, mainly because they can help add variety to the meals that you cook. And even if you use the same basic ingredients over and over again, adding different spices to those each time that you cook it can make them taste vastly different. And most spices can last between 2 and 10 years. And a lot of the time you can put the jar and everything directly into the bag, but be careful with the oxygen absorbers since a lot of spice mixes have a high salt content. Oxygen absorbers can cause salt to harden the same way that it does sugar. When it comes to shelf life, a lot of the time spices aren't gonna really go bad. They're just gonna lose flavor and nutrient content over time. An example of this would be a little while back I ate some Tony's Cajun seasoning that had expired 6 years ago. And it didn't make me sick, but it wasn't nearly as spicy as it normally is, even though Tony's isn't all that terribly spicy. But it was just kind of salty and didn't really taste like it should have. And in addition to spices, also stock up on condiments also. They may not have as long of a shelf life as some other foods on this list, but like spices, they can add some variety to your diet. And it is important to store foods that don't necessarily have an indefinite shelf life. Things like cooking oil, olive oil, then yeast if you're baking bread, those are all examples of things that you want to stockpile and rotate. And y'all, these are not the only foods that have a long shelf life that you should be stockpiling. A while back, I did a video that was survival foods that never expire. So if you want to check that out, be sure to click on this card. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.